What kind of gentle soul becomes the weary guardian of voices crying out from places the living cannot fully understand? Welcome, dear friends. Wherever you may be listening tonight, gathered in quiet faith and shared remembrance. Please subscribe to join our peaceful community as we begin this spiritual journey together. Saint Nicholas of Tolentino's life unfolds as a quiet path of compassion and hidden suffering, where visions of pleading souls shaped his devotion, his sacrifice, and a legacy of tender hope for all who seek God's mercy in their need. As the first notes of this journey continue from the stillness of the introduction, Part 1 gently opens with the same quiet breath, returning us to the earliest moments of a life that began in the soft shadows of a small Italian village, as if God himself were drawing a delicate line across history through the birth of a child who would one day carry the weight of unseen souls. Nicholas was born in 1245 in the hilltop town of Sant'Angelo in Pontano, a place where stone houses clung to the rising earth and narrow paths wound through fields of olives and wheat, and where faith lived quietly inside the rhythms of sun and season. His parents, Compagnones and Amata, were simple people, not wealthy and not influential, but marked by a deep devotion that grew stronger through hardship. They longed for a child, prayed for a child, waited for a child. And when at last Nicholas arrived, small and fragile in their arms, they held him as though he were a promise they had almost lost. His mother would later remember his birth as an answer to a vow whispered in tears, after years of fearing that God had closed his hand. Some stories say that before he was conceived, his parents had visited a shrine of Saint Nicholas of Myra and begged for the grace of a child. Whether or not this is certain, what is known is that from the very beginning his life seemed like a gift protected by faith. He was their long-awaited son, a sign that heaven had remembered them. The infant grew slowly, as if careful with his own strength. The midwives worried over his frailty, and the neighbors whispered gently that such delicate children were like candles flickering in the wind. But his mother would not allow fear to overshadow hope. She wrapped him in soft cloth, held him near her heart, and prayed over him in the quiet of dawn. His father especially believed that Nicholas had been given by God for a purpose they could not yet understand. And in that time, when the world was harsh and survival uncertain, parents often made vows of gratitude or protection. Nicholas's parents were no different. They promised that if he lived, if he grew strong enough to walk, they would offer him to God's service. It was a solemn promise, woven not out of fear, but of gratitude. This vow, made when Nicholas was too young to even open his eyes fully, would become the seed of a destiny that shaped the rest of his life. As Nicholas grew into early childhood, his quiet temperament became clear. Unlike other boys who chased one another through the fields or shouted across the village streets, he preferred silence. He watched the world with wide, contemplative eyes. Sounds touched him differently, the wind moving through the cypress trees, the distant murmur of conversations at dusk, and most of all, the ringing of the church bells. He would pause whatever he was doing when he heard them, as if something inside him stirred, as though some unseen call reached gently into his small heart. It was not the behavior of a timid child, but of one already drawn toward something beyond the ordinary. His mother sometimes found him standing near the church door, his small hands clasped, gazing at the flickering candles within. She did not interrupt him. She simply watched, sensing that grace was beginning to whisper. There were moments when the townspeople noticed something unusual in the boy as well. He had a tenderness that was almost instinctive. When he saw an injured animal or a weary traveler passing through town, he reacted with deep compassion. Once, when he was still very young, he offered his own small loaf of bread to a stranger who appeared cold and hungry. It was not surprising to his parents, who knew his generous heart, but it touched others who saw it. They would later remember his kindness as though his holiness had already begun to form in shadows. Still, childhood is never without difficulty, and Nicholas was no exception. His body remained thin, often prone to illness. There were nights when his mother stayed awake, fearing that his breathing sounded too faint or his fever too high. But each time, Nicholas recovered with quiet strength, and each recovery reminded his parents of the vow they had made. When he was old enough to understand speech, they told him gently that he belonged to God in a special way, that his life had begun with a promise. The boy listened, not with fear or confusion, but with a softness that suggested the words felt familiar, as though his soul had always known what his mind was only now hearing. Nicholas grew in this atmosphere of quiet faith, surrounded by the humble beauty of village life. The hills around Sant'Angelo seemed to cradle the town, offering a sense of protection. The fields glowed golden in summer, and in winter a silent mist often covered the land like a veil. These natural rhythms shaped his early memories, giving his heart a sensitivity that later allowed him to feel the spiritual world with deep intensity. Even as a child, he seemed to understand suffering in a way that surpassed his years. When his father once fell ill from working too hard in the fields, Nicholas sat beside him for long hours, whispering prayers, holding his hand. His mother watched from the doorway with a quiet ache in her chest, seeing in her son a depth of compassion she could not explain. It was around this time, during his early years, that the family's vow became more than a distant promise. His parents took him to the church more often, encouraging him to spend moments in silence. The Augustinian friars, who tended to the spiritual needs of the region, would occasionally pass through Sant'Angelo, and Nicholas observed them with quiet admiration. Their simple black habits, their gentle voices, and their calm presence left an impression on him that he carried long after they departed. One story tells of a day when Nicholas, still no more than a child, sat in the church alone. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, forming slender beams that illuminated the dust drifting softly in the air. He watched the light silently, feeling as if time had slowed around him. It was in that moment, he would later say, that he first felt the desire to belong completely to God. It was not dramatic, not overwhelming, simply a soft, peaceful stirring inside his soul. A beginning. As part one draws to its gentle close, the early threads of Nicholas's life lie quietly before us. A fragile birth, a vow whispered in hope, a childhood marked by compassion and a mysterious inwardness. In these tender beginnings, his path was already being shaped by grace, slowly, gently, like dawn spreading across a sleeping landscape. And one might wonder in this early stillness how such a gentle boy would one day become the weary intercessor for souls no one else could hear. As the quiet threads of his childhood settle into memory, Part 2 takes shape like a continuation of the same soft breath, carrying us from the earliest whispers of his vocation into the unfolding of a youth marked by a sensitivity that seemed almost otherworldly, as though every experience sank deeper into his heart than into the hearts of ordinary children. In those years when most boys were learning the roughness of the world, Nicholas felt everything with gentle intensity. The hills around Sant'Angelo became his first teachers of silence, and their slow changing seasons taught him to listen not only with his ears, but with his soul. He would linger on pathways where the wind hummed softly against the grass, letting the quiet wrap around him the way others might wrap themselves in blankets. Even his parents sometimes wondered at his stillness. noticing how he rarely spoke unless needed, how his eyes seemed to absorb the world's light more than reflect it, and how he carried himself with the unhurried grace of someone already half attuned to heaven. Life in a medieval village was not without its hardships, and Nicholas's early sensitivity might have been overshadowed by the daily struggles of ordinary families. Yet there was something in him that stood apart, not in pride or separation, but in the way he was drawn toward the deeper truths hidden in simple moments. When the elders gathered in the square to tell stories of saints and miracles, Nicholas listened with a reverence that made even the storytellers pause. He felt as though the saints were not distant figures from the past, but living companions whose footsteps still echoed in the world. And when he knelt in the small stone church, gazing at the crucifix illuminated by candlelight, he sensed that the suffering of Christ was not merely a tale of long ago, but a living invitation to love more deeply than he understood. There were times when his mother, watching him from the doorway as he prayed with small hands folded carefully, felt a quiet awe mixed with apprehension. She had prayed for a child, had begged heaven for the grace to become a mother. And now she wondered whether heaven had claimed more of him than she expected. Yet she never interfered. She let grace do its work, trusting that God's plans, however mysterious, would guide her son's steps. One of the clearest signs of Nicholas's developing interior life emerged in the way he responded to suffering. He felt drawn to the poor, the sick, the lonely. When travelers rested outside the village walls, weary from long journeys, Nicholas approached them with the openness of a child who saw Christ in every stranger. Sometimes he brought them water, sometimes food, and other times he simply sat with them, listening to their stories. Those who encountered him often remembered him long afterward, not because he said anything remarkable, but because his presence carried a quiet consolation. It was as though he understood their burdens without needing to hear them expressed. Yet his sensitivity also brought him moments of quiet sorrow. He could not bear to see animals mistreated, and he once cried for hours after witnessing a neighbor strike a mule too harshly. His father comforted him gently, telling him that the world was full of pain and that no one could erase all suffering. But Nicholas, even as a child, believed that compassion, no matter how small, mattered to God. This conviction settled deep into his heart and would one day become the foundation of his calling. During these early years, the church bells of Sant'Angelo became a constant presence in Nicholas's life. Their sound, rising above the rooftops and drifting across the fields, stirred something inside him that he could not fully explain. When the bells rang for Mass, he walked with quiet anticipation. When they tolled for funerals, he felt a solemn ache, as though some unseen connection bound him to the sorrows of the community. Even the Angelus bells at dusk filled him with a gentle longing, a yearning for something beyond earthly life. It was as if each chime reminded him that heaven was near, just beyond the veil of ordinary moments. As Nicholas approached the age of discernment, the vow his parents had made began to take form in their discussions. They did not pressure him. Instead, they gently reminded him of the promise made before his birth, a promise offered in gratitude and trust. Nicholas did not respond with fear or reluctance. The idea of belonging to God already lived quietly within him, like a seed ready to break through the soil. He simply listened, nodding softly, as though the words aligned with something he had always known. One quiet afternoon, while walking alone along a hillside path, Nicholas experienced a moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The sun was low, casting a soft golden light across the earth, and the air was filled with the scent of wild herbs. He felt drawn to sit beneath a tree, watching the play of shadows across the ground. As he sat there, breathing in the stillness, he felt a sudden warmth fill his chest, not like physical heat, but like a gentle, enveloping presence. It was as though God were leaning close, speaking without words. Nicholas later described the moment as a soft touch upon his soul, a touch that awakened a deeper certainty that his life belonged entirely to God. It was not a dramatic vision, not a heavenly apparition. It was a quiet revelation, perfectly fitted to a child whose spirituality had always been formed in silence. When he rose from the ground, he felt older in spirit, more certain of the path ahead. The world around him looked the same, and yet something inside him had shifted. He walked home slowly, thinking of the church, the friars, the candles flickering in the dimness, and the way prayer felt like breathing. There was no fear in him, only a gentle resolve. At home, his parents noticed the change but did not comment. They simply welcomed him to the dinner table, giving thanks for the day. But his mother later said that when she looked into his eyes that evening, she sensed a new depth, as if he had seen something she could not. She felt a quiet stirring of both joy and sorrow, knowing that a life dedicated to God is often a life marked by sacrifice. In the months that followed, Nicholas began spending more time in prayer, sometimes rising before dawn to kneel in the cold stillness of the church. The parish priest, who had observed him since childhood, recognized the signs of a vocation blooming quietly. He spoke kindly with Nicholas, guiding him gently, never forcing, always encouraging him to listen to God's voice within his heart. And the more Nicholas prayed, the more he felt drawn to a life of simplicity, contemplation, and service. Even the villagers, who had long admired his gentleness, began to see him as different, not distant, but touched by something sacred. They watched him grow with a mix of admiration and quiet wonder, sensing that his path was not one marked by worldly ambition, but by a deeper calling. As part 2 comes to a soft close, the foundations of Nicholas's vocation lie quietly in place, formed by childhood tenderness, early prayer, and a soul that listened more deeply than most. And now one might gently ask, what further steps would God place before this boy whose heart already leaned toward the sacred? As the soft thread of his early stirrings continues to unfold, part 3 begins by carrying forward the quiet certainty forming within Nicholas, leading him toward the first great turning point of his life, his encounter with the Augustinians. It was a transition not marked by trumpet or ceremony, but by the gentle and unmistakable pull of grace, drawing him from the quiet hills of his childhood into a deeper and more committed path. By the time he reached adolescence, his longing for a life devoted entirely to God had taken clearer shape. His heart seemed to rest only in silence and prayer, and though he loved his parents deeply, he felt increasingly aware that the tender promise made before his birth was not only theirs to fulfill, but his. Each morning he woke with a quiet sense of direction, and each evening he felt as though the day had carried him just a little closer to a place he had not yet reached, but already loved. The village of Sant'Angelo in Pontano lay along small routes used by mendicant friars who traveled from one town to another carrying news, preaching, and offering pastoral care. Nicholas had seen these men before, but as he grew older, their presence began to stir him in a different way. Among them were the Augustinians, a community known for their simplicity, prayerfulness, and devotion to interior life. Their long black habits contrasted with the earth-toned garments of farmers and townspeople, and their movements carried a calm attentiveness that made them stand out. They were neither loud nor severe. They seemed to listen more than they spoke, and when they preached, their voices carried a warmth that did not demand attention, but invited it gently. Nicholas found himself drawn to them even before he knew their name. One early morning, while walking toward the church for prayer, he saw a small group of Augustinians resting outside the village. Their faces were tired from travel, yet their eyes held a serenity that caught him by surprise. One of the friars, an older man with a thin frame and soft gaze, greeted Nicholas with a smile that seemed to open a quiet space between them. The friar asked him simple questions: where he lived, whether he studied, what he loved most about the church. Nicholas answered softly, almost shyly, but the friar listened with genuine attentiveness. He did not praise Nicholas or draw grand conclusions. He simply listened, nodding gently, as though he already sensed the movement of God in the boy. Nicholas felt no pressure, no expectation, only the peace of being understood. This meeting lingered in Nicholas's memory like a candle that continued glowing long after it had been extinguished. He returned home with a fullness in his heart that he could not easily explain. He felt a quiet yearning not only for prayer, but for the life these men lived. Over the months that followed, he sought more opportunities to meet the Augustinians whenever they passed through. He observed their humility, the way they walked with quiet purpose, the way their words carried a depth grounded in contemplation. He noticed how they seemed content with little, not out of resignation, but out of a sense that simplicity left more room for God. There came a day when Nicholas, after long reflection, sought out the parish priest to confide his growing desire. He spoke softly, describing his attraction to religious life, his longing for prayer, and his sense that God was calling him to something more than the ordinary. The priest listened without interruption, his expression gentle. When Nicholas finished, the priest placed a hand on his shoulder and said that the stirrings in his heart were not unusual for those whom God was preparing for a special path. He encouraged him to continue praying, to listen carefully, to be patient with the timing of grace. Nicholas nodded, feeling both comforted and deepened by the conversation. As time passed, the inward pull towards the Augustinians only grew stronger. Nicholas tried to imagine himself living the life of a farmer, a tradesman, or a village laborer, but none of these roles settled in his spirit. His heart remained oriented toward silence, toward liturgy, toward the deeper rhythms of spiritual life. There were nights when he walked alone under the distant glow of the stars, whispering prayers and asking God to show him the way. And each time, the gentle whisper of grace seemed to draw him toward the same direction, toward the black-habited friars who lived in humble communities of prayer and service. His parents, observing his deepening devotion, understood what was happening long before Nicholas spoke openly with them. His mother felt a quiet sadness at the thought of letting him go, but she also remembered the vow she and her husband had made all those years ago. She trusted that the path unfolding before Nicholas was not one forced by human promise, but shaped by divine intention. His father, though slower to accept the idea of parting with his son, found peace in the thought that Nicholas's life belonged to something greater than the simple tasks of the earth. Eventually, the time came when Nicholas felt ready to speak to his parents. One evening, as the sun cast long golden rays across their small home, he sat with them and shared, in his soft and steady voice, the longing that had been growing within him. He explained that he felt called to join the Augustinians, to give his life fully to God in prayer, simplicity, and service. His parents listened in silence, his mother's eyes filled with tears, and his father's face softened with quiet acceptance. After a long pause, they both nodded. They had given him to God in a promise. Now they were giving him again, freely, with love, with their blessing. Nicholas approached the Augustinian friars, who remained periodically near the region. The friars received him with the same gentle warmth he had always admired in them. They did not greet him with ceremony or excitement, but with the simple peace that marked everything they did. They told him that the journey ahead would be one of humility, prayer, obedience, and sacrifice. Nicholas felt no fear. He felt only a quiet certainty, as though stepping into a place that had been waiting for him since the day he was born. He left his home with few possessions, only what the rule permitted, and walked beside the friars toward the house where he would begin his new life. The road was familiar, yet every step felt different, like a small surrender, a small offering. He did not look back often, not out of coldness, but because his heart felt held in God's hands. When the village finally disappeared behind the hills, he felt neither loss nor triumph, only the calm of someone walking toward the purpose for which he had been created. As he arrived at the Augustinian house, where he would begin his formation, Nicholas felt a deep stillness settle over him. The walls were plain, the chapel small, the cells narrow. Yet everything felt right. The silence felt like home. The rhythm of prayer felt like breath. And in that moment, Nicholas understood that the vow whispered over his life before he ever drew breath had quietly become his own vow, freely chosen, lovingly embraced. As Part 3 comes to its gentle close, the path deepens, the horizon widens, and the young man who once prayed alone beneath the trees has now stepped fully into the first chapter of his consecrated life. And one may now wonder, with a soft curiosity, how would the quiet novitiate shape the heart of a boy who already carried such tenderness within him? As the gentle path of his calling unfolds further, Part 4 begins by carrying the quiet momentum of his first steps into religious life, into the deeper interior landscape of the novitiate, that sacred season when a soul is stripped of noise and drawn, little by little, into the transforming silence of God. When Nicholas arrived at the Augustinian house, he felt as though he had stepped into a place that matched the hidden architecture of his own heart. The walls were bare, the corridors simple, the chapel small and dimly lit, yet every corner seemed to welcome him with the soft promise of a life built not upon worldly ambition, but upon prayer, humility, and the quiet surrender of the will. His days began before dawn, when the world outside lay in hushed darkness, and the first thin candle was lit in the chapel. In that stillness he discovered a rhythm he had always longed for, the gentle rise and fall of psalms chanted slowly, the scriptures read with reverence, the silence resting like dew on the soul. The novitiate demanded obedience, but for Nicholas, obedience was not a burden. It was a widening of the heart, a letting go that allowed God to fill every empty space within. He took to the rule with sincerity, embracing the routine tasks assigned to him, cleaning the floors, tending the small garden, carrying water, assisting older friars, as though each act were a thread in a tapestry he would never fully see completed. His superiors noticed his willingness not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady, the way water wears gently into stone. Nicholas listened more than he spoke, worked without drawing attention to himself, and moved through the monastery with the soft-footed grace of someone who felt God's presence in every ordinary moment. Yet the novitiate was not only a time of peaceful prayer, it was also a season of interior testing, the slow and often hidden purification of the heart. His body, still fragile from childhood, did not always bear the demands of monastic life easily. The fasts were frequent and strict, the nights short, and the winters cold. But Nicholas welcomed the discomforts as invitations to detach from the comforts of the world. When hunger gnawed at him, he offered it silently to God. When weariness threatened to dull his concentration during prayer, he reminded himself that love grows through perseverance. He had a natural inclination toward austerity, but his superiors guided him gently, reminding him that holiness was not achieved through exaggerated penance, but through humble fidelity to the rule. Still, Nicholas often sought the smallest sacrifices to offer quietly. He might give up a bit of rest, take the least appealing task, or offer a silent prayer in place of some small comfort. These hidden gestures shaped him more deeply than he realized, forming in him the spiritual resilience that would one day sustain him through far greater trials. As he immersed himself in the life of prayer, Nicholas discovered that interior silence was not an empty void, but a space where God spoke most clearly. There were moments during meditation when he felt a warmth in his chest, a gentle stirring that made him aware of the divine presence in a way that transcended words. And there were other moments when he felt nothing at all, when prayer seemed dry and God distant. Instead of discouraging him, these barren hours taught him the steady patience of faith. He learned that holiness was not measured by spiritual sweetness, but by fidelity to God's will, even when the path felt hidden. In those early months, he also grew deeply attached to the Eucharist. The moment of consecration filled him with a reverent trembling, a quiet awe that sometimes brought tears to his eyes. He felt that Christ, in his humility, mirrored the very life the friars sought to live. Simple, self-giving, hidden from the world, yet sustaining it in silence. This Eucharistic love became the anchor of Nicholas's vocation, a flame that would remain steady even in the darkest nights of his future. Life in the novitiate also taught him the beauty of community. Though he naturally inclined toward solitude, he cherished the brothers with whom he prayed and worked. Their simple kindness, their shared struggles, their quiet laughter during moments of recreation, all of these experiences knit him into a family bound not by blood, but by a shared longing for God. He learned to see Christ in them, even when personalities clashed or patience grew thin. When the older friars corrected him, their words sometimes stung, but Nicholas received them with humility, recognizing that correction was part of the refining fire that made a heart more like Christ's. Over time, his brothers came to trust him with their own burdens. They sensed in him a gentleness that invited confidence, a peaceful presence that made others feel seen without judgment. Though he never set out to become an example, he became one simply by the quiet integrity of his life. There were evenings when the community sat together after their work was done, sharing stories of saints or recalling moments from their own journeys. Nicholas listened with an attentiveness that made the speakers feel their words mattered. Yet what touched him most deeply during these gatherings were not the extraordinary tales, but the simple witness of ordinary faith. A brother who persevered despite illness, another who smiled despite hardship, another who forgave despite injury. These examples became for him a kind of living scripture, teaching him that holiness often blooms in hidden soil. Amid all this growth, the first subtle signs of his extraordinary discipline began to appear. Nicholas felt an increasing desire for deeper prayer, longer silence, and greater sacrifice. He did not push himself beyond the rule out of pride, but out of love. His longing for God was not restless but calm, like a river flowing steadily toward the sea. He often lingered in the chapel after others had gone, praying in the dim light before the tabernacle, letting his heart rest in the presence of Christ. These were the hours that shaped him most profoundly, the hours when the world seemed to fade and only God remained. Yet even as he grew spiritually, his physical weakness remained. At times his frail body trembled under the weight of fasting or long vigils, and the brothers urged him to moderate his zeal. But Nicholas, though obedient to their instructions, accepted his weakness with serene humility. He believed that God used the fragile to reveal his strength, and that suffering, when offered with love, became a quiet prayer rising to heaven. As Part 4 flows gently toward its close, the image of the young novice emerges with clarity, a soul shaped by silence, humbled by obedience, deepened by prayer, and prepared, though he does not yet know it, for a mission far greater and far heavier than anything he has yet experienced. And one might now wonder softly, as the candlelight of the novitiate flickers around him, how would this gentle obedience carry him into the sacred responsibilities of the priesthood, where grace and weakness would meet in profound and mysterious ways? As the quiet rhythm of his novitiate settles like a deep breath into the memory of his soul, Part 5 begins by following Nicholas into the next sacred threshold of his journey, his ordination to the priesthood, a moment both radiant and shadowed by the first hints of a lifelong fragility that would accompany him like an uninvited yet strangely sanctifying companion. The transition from novice to professed Augustinian and then to priest was not a sudden leap, but a slow, deliberate unfolding, as though God were shaping him the way a potter shapes clay, turning him gently in his hands, smoothing, refining, allowing imperfections to become channels of grace. Nicholas approached ordination with the same interior stillness that had marked his childhood and his formation. He felt no ambition for status, no desire to stand above others, no inclination toward the weight of spiritual authority. Instead, he felt a trembling reverence for the mystery of the priesthood, for the grace entrusted to fragile human hands, and for the quiet responsibility of offering Christ's mercy to souls seeking refuge. The years leading towards ordination were filled with study, prayer, and the kind of spiritual deepening that comes not from intellectual mastery alone, but from a heart slowly conformed to the heart of Christ. Nicholas studied Scripture with profound attentiveness, lingering over passages that spoke of mercy, sacrifice, and the nearness of God to the poor and afflicted. He was particularly moved by the letters of St. Paul, whose words about weakness becoming strength resonated deeply with his own experience. He understood, in a way that was both intuitive and heartfelt, that holiness was not the triumph of human effort, but the yielding of one's whole being to God's transforming love. His theological training, while rigorous, never dulled his spiritual sensitivity. Instead, it sharpened his awareness of how vast and tender God's mercy truly was. During this time, Nicholas also grew in pastoral sensitivity. The friars often assigned him small tasks that allowed him to serve the needs of the local faithful, bringing comfort to the sick, assisting in the distribution of food, offering silent companionship to those who mourned. He approached each act of service not as a duty to be completed, but as a moment of encounter with Christ, hidden within human suffering. The poor especially sensed this. They felt in him a gentleness that required no words, a presence that made them feel seen and valued. Nicholas learned that ministry began not with eloquence or authority, but with compassion, a lesson that would shape his entire priesthood. As the day of his ordination approached, Nicholas found himself experiencing a mix of anticipation and quiet awe. He often spent long hours in the chapel, contemplating the mystery of the Eucharist and the unfathomable grace that would soon pass through his own hands. He trembled at the thought, not out of fear of failure, but out of the profound humility that recognized how small he was before the infinite love of God. His brothers noticed this gentle seriousness, and though they knew he was well prepared, they also sensed that Nicholas's heart carried a weight that few could fully understand. The morning of his ordination dawned softly, with a pale light filtering through the chapel windows. The scent of incense lingered gently in the air, mingling with the quiet rustling of robes and the low murmur of prayers. Nicholas knelt before the bishop, his face calm yet luminous with emotion. As the bishop laid hands upon him, Nicholas felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sensation both delicate and profound. It was as though God himself were imprinting grace upon the fragile vessel of his life, sealing him with a mission that would stretch far beyond anything he could imagine. When he rose to his feet, newly ordained, his eyes glistened with tears, not of joy alone, but of a reverent fear that sensed the immense mystery now entrusted to him. That first Mass marked one of the most tender moments of his life. The chapel was simple, its stones worn smooth by generations of prayer, yet to Nicholas it felt like a sacred mountain. His hands trembled slightly as he offered the chalice, not from uncertainty, but from the overwhelming realization that he was touching the mystery of Christ's sacrifice. Those who attended the Mass recalled later that his face seemed illuminated with something they could not name, as though heaven hovered near him. His voice remained soft, but every word carried a depth that invited the faithful into a place of peace. When he consumed the Eucharist he had just consecrated, he felt as though the boundary between heaven and earth had thinned to a fragile veil, and for a moment the weight of God's love pressed so deeply into him that he feared he might weep aloud. Yet even amid this radiance, his physical weakness became more noticeable. The demands of his formation, the fasting, the long hours of prayer, and the weight of emotional sensitivity had worn his body thin. There were times in the weeks following his ordination when fatigue washed over him like an unexpected tide, leaving him pale and trembling. The brothers urged him to rest more, but Nicholas, though obedient, found rest difficult when his heart longed to serve. He was not reckless, he was simply generous to the point of forgetting himself. And so his priesthood began with a delicate balance between grace and frailty, a balance that marked his entire life. In his early ministry, Nicholas discovered that the priesthood deepened his compassion in unexpected ways. When he heard confessions, he listened with the tenderness of someone who understood the fragility of the human heart. He felt no judgment toward penitents, only a deep desire to offer them the mercy he himself had encountered. When he celebrated Mass, he did so with the reverence of one who recognized that the altar was not merely a table, but a place where heaven and earth met. And when he prayed the divine office with his brothers, his voice carried a steadiness that belied the weakness of his body, as though the Psalms themselves provided strength beyond his own. Yet he also experienced the loneliness that sometimes accompanies the priesthood. There were days when he felt the weight of souls pressing upon him, not yet the cries of purgatory that would later torment him, but the burdens of the living, the sorrow of widows, the fears of the poor, the despair of the sick. Nicholas absorbed these sorrows as though they were his own, holding them in prayer long after others had forgotten. His compassion was a gift, but it also opened his heart to a quiet suffering that few perceived. And still he did not draw back. He believed that a priest was called to carry the burdens of others, to stand beside Christ in the garden of human sorrow, and to offer his own heart as a refuge for those who could not bear their pain alone. In the midst of this delicate balance, something within Nicholas continued to grow. A deeper trust in God, a willingness to surrender everything, even his health, to the service of souls. He did not know then how profound the demands on his heart would become, how the cries of the unseen would one day fill his nights. For now, he simply lived his priesthood with the same quiet fidelity that had marked every step of his life. As Part 5 draws to its gentle close, the image of Nicholas as a newly ordained priest settles into the soft light of contemplation, a man of fragile body yet resilient spirit, standing at the threshold of a mission far greater than he can foresee. His ordination marks not a culmination, but a beginning, a quiet dawn before a long and shadowed day. And one may now wonder, in a whisper almost too soft to hear, how would this humble priest respond when obedience called him away from the familiar into a new place where his hidden gifts would slowly reveal themselves? As the gentle light of his first priestly years softens into memory, Part 6 begins by carrying Nicholas forward along the quiet road of obedience, a road that would lead him away from the familiar surroundings of his formation and into the humble, unassuming town where his true mission would quietly unfold. His superiors, discerning his spirit and sensing both his depth of compassion and the fragility of his health, believed that a place of calm pastoral rhythm would suit him better than the more strenuous duties of larger communities. And so, with the simple obedience that had marked every step of his life, Nicholas accepted the instruction to leave his current house and travel to the small Augustinian community in Tolentino. It was a decision he did not question, for he believed that God's will often moved through the gentle voice of obedience. In his heart, he trusted that wherever he was sent, grace would meet him there. The journey to Tolentino was not long, but it felt to Nicholas like a quiet pilgrimage. As he walked beside one of the friars assigned to accompany him, the landscape unfolded in slow, peaceful layers: rolling hills, clusters of vineyards, fields brushed with the soft colors of the season. The road curved gently, never rushing toward its destination, as though reflecting the rhythm of the life Nicholas was being called to live. The friar who walked with him spoke occasionally about the town, its people, and its simplicity. He described Tolentino as a place without grandeur, without great commerce, without political significance. It was a town where ordinary people lived quiet lives, shaped by the seasons, touched by daily labor, and bound together by faith. Nicholas listened with the calm attentiveness that marked his character, feeling a growing peace within him. A place without grandeur did not trouble him. If anything, it comforted him. He had no desire for fame or recognition. He longed only for a life that allowed him to serve God quietly, without distraction. When they arrived in Tolentino, the town greeted them not with ceremony but with the gentle unremarkableness of daily life. Children played in the narrow streets, merchants tended small stalls, and women drew water from the wells. The church and priory stood near the center of town, modest in size yet warm in atmosphere. Nicholas felt a softness settle over him as he stepped through the doorway of the community where he would now live. The brothers welcomed him with simple smiles, offering the hospitality that was characteristic of their order. He was given a small cell, furnished with nothing more than a wooden bed, a table, and a crucifix on the wall. It was enough. In fact, it was more than enough, for it matched the quiet desires of his heart. Life in Tolentino unfolded in a gentle, steady rhythm that suited Nicholas perfectly. He quickly learned the daily needs of the community and the pastoral requests of the townspeople. He assisted in celebrating Mass, heard confessions, visited the sick, and offered prayers for those burdened by sorrow. He became known not for eloquent preaching or dramatic gestures, but for his quiet presence. People sensed in him a tenderness and sincerity that made them feel safe bringing their most fragile worries. Nicholas never hurried them. He listened with the patience of someone who believed that every soul carried its own sacred story, and that listening itself was an act of mercy. Despite his deep commitment to prayer and ministry, Nicholas did not seek to impose himself upon the community. He blended into the rhythm of the friar's life like a gentle note in a larger harmony. His body, still thin and often weary, did not always allow him to take on the more strenuous tasks, but he offered what strength he had with humility. The brothers respected him for his sincerity, though they sometimes worried about the depth of his fasting and the intensity of his devotion. They saw how his inner fire burned brightly, even when his body faltered. And though they cautioned him gently, they also recognized that God had given Nicholas a heart shaped for sacrifice. Evenings in Tolentino held a particular sweetness for Nicholas. After the day's duties were completed, he would linger in the chapel, letting the silence settle around him like a warm cloak. The candles cast soft circles of light across the stone floor, and the quiet felt alive with presence. In those hours, he prayed not only for himself, but for the people of the town, for the brothers he lived with, and for the needs he sensed but never heard spoken aloud. He had a gift for intercession, a mysterious awareness of the burdens others carried, and a deep desire to lift those burdens before God. Often, he prayed long after the others had retired, whispering the psalms slowly, letting each word take root in his heart. It was during these evening vigils that Nicholas began to sense something stir within him, something he could not yet understand. At first, it was nothing more than a heightened awareness, a sense that the veil between the earthly and the spiritual was thinner than he had ever perceived before. He felt the silence deepen in a way he could not name. Sometimes he would pause in his prayers, sensing a presence near him, not alarming but unusual, as though the walls themselves held memories of souls long past. He did not speak of these sensations to the brothers, for he was not yet sure what they meant. Instead, he simply continued to pray, believing that whatever he sensed was part of the hidden workings of grace. His ministry outside the monastery also widened quietly. People from the surrounding countryside came to Tolentino seeking comfort, advice, or prayer. Word spread that the gentle friar had a way of calming troubled hearts, though Nicholas never sought such attention. He remained humble, almost shy, whenever people praised him. To him, every grace came from God alone, and he saw himself merely as a small instrument in a larger symphony of divine mercy. The more he served the people, the deeper his compassion grew, and the deeper his compassion grew, the more he found himself drawn into prayer, as though his heart needed to carry every sorrow he encountered back to the quiet presence of God. The brothers sometimes wondered how Nicholas could hold so much within him. They saw the way his face softened whenever someone spoke of suffering, the way his eyes filled with quiet ache when he prayed for the sick or the dying. Even they could not fully understand the depths of his interior life, for Nicholas rarely spoke about his personal spiritual experiences. He believed that the most intimate movements of grace were meant to be guarded in silence, hidden even from those closest to him. In time, the people of Tolentino came to see Nicholas as part of the very soul of their town. His presence was like a gentle lamp burning steadily in a quiet corner, giving light not flamboyantly but faithfully. Yet even as his life blended into the rhythms of this small community, the first shadows of a deeper, more mysterious calling began to gather around him. Shadows that would one day lead him into encounters no ordinary priest expected. Encounters that would mark him as the guardian of souls, not only in this world, but in the world beyond. As Part 6 comes to a tender close, we see Nicholas settling into Tolentino with the peace of someone who has arrived exactly where God intended him to be. The quiet streets, the humble people, the gentle duties of pastoral life. All these formed the backdrop for the next chapter of his journey, a chapter that would draw him deeper into the mystery of suffering souls. And one might now wonder, in the soft hush of reflection, what unseen door was quietly opening in the silence of his nights, preparing him for the first vision that would forever change his life. As the steady rhythm of his days in Tolentino deepens into a familiar pattern of prayer, service, and quiet charity, Part 7 begins by carrying Nicholas gently across the threshold that would forever alter the course of his life. A threshold marked not by external events, but by an unseen world drawing near, pressing its weight upon him in the silence of the night. For years he had lived in Tolentino with serene devotion, offering every breath of his fragile body to the service of God and the care of souls. Those around him saw only his gentleness, his attentiveness, his small acts of charity that flowed effortlessly from a heart attuned to compassion. But within him, something was slowly awakening, something that began as a subtle stirring during his long vigils in the quiet chapel, and deepened into moments of mysterious unease he could not easily explain. It began with restlessness. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have drawn attention from his brothers. But Nicholas felt it. At night, after the monastery had grown silent and the last candles had burned low, he found himself lingering in prayer longer than usual, sensing a heaviness in the air that had not been present before. The silence seemed different, as though filled with an invisible tension, a kind of spiritual gravity that pulled gently at the edges of his awareness. He felt watched, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggested presence. Sometimes he paused during his prayers, the words still warm on his lips, feeling as though someone or something were waiting just beyond the reach of his senses. He could not name it. He could only feel it. At first, he dismissed these sensations as the effects of fatigue or the natural sensitivity of a soul deeply immersed in contemplation. His body remained frail, weakened by fasting and long hours of prayer, and he wondered whether his mind was simply magnifying shadows into shapes. But the unease did not fade. Instead, it grew more distinct, more insistent. And then came the dreams that felt less like dreams and more like glimpses into a world pressing against his own. In one such dream, he found himself standing in a vast, dim landscape, neither earthly nor heavenly. Around him rose a soft, mournful wailing, like the sound of wind moving through distant caverns, yet the cries carried unmistakable anguish. He saw no figures, no faces, only a kind of murky twilight, heavy and suffocating. The cries grew louder, echoing through the shadows, and Nicholas felt them resonate within his chest, as though they were tugging at his very heart. He woke with tears on his cheeks, his breath trembling, the memory of the cries lingering in the darkness of his cell. He remained awake until dawn, praying for these unseen souls without knowing who they were or what they sought from him. The dreams returned again and again, each time more vivid, more haunting. Sometimes he saw faces, blurred, pale, contorted with sorrow, reaching toward him with imploring hands. Sometimes he heard names whispered in voices that trembled with desperation. Other times, he felt himself drawn toward a soft, flickering light in the distance, only to wake before reaching it. Despite the fear these dreams stirred in him, Nicholas did not recoil. He prayed more fervently, offering his fasting and his suffering for these souls whose cries pierced his heart. He believed that compassion was stronger than fear, and that whatever he was experiencing was not meant to harm him, but to invite him deeper into the mystery of God's mercy. Still, the nights grew heavier. His body, already fragile, grew weaker under the strain. He ate less, slept less, prayed more. The brothers noticed his growing pallor and tremulous hands, and they worried. They urged him to rest, to take nourishment, to ease the severity of his fasting. Nicholas listened obediently whenever instructed, but he could not deny the weight pressing upon him each night. Something in the unseen world was calling for him, and he could not turn away. The cries of the souls felt like a plea that only his heart could hear, and though he did not fully understand this strange calling, he trusted that God would reveal its meaning in his time. Then came the night that shattered the boundary between dream and reality. Nicholas had gone to the chapel after Compline, as he often did, drawn by a longing for silence and prayer. The candles flickered softly, casting warm, trembling circles of light around the sanctuary. He knelt before the tabernacle, pressing his forehead to the cool stone floor, whispering words of love to Christ present in the Eucharist. For a long time, the quiet held him gently. But then the air shifted. He felt a chill sweep through the chapel, though no door had opened, no breeze entered. The candles began to tremble, their flames thinning into wavering threads of light. Nicholas raised his head slowly, sensing that he was no longer alone. The silence thickened, as though dense with breathless expectancy. And then, emerging from the shadows near the far wall, he saw a dim, faint glow, pale, bluish, like moonlight filtered through mist. The glow wavered, coalesced, and then slowly took shape into the outline of a human figure. Nicholas felt no urge to run. Instead, he remained kneeling, his heart pounding yet strangely calm. The figure moved toward him in slow, gliding motions, its features indistinct but undeniably human. A soft, mournful voice reached him, trembling like wind through leaves. "Father Nicholas," it whispered, "pray for us." The words were not a command, but a plea filled with aching desperation, a plea that pierced Nicholas to the soul. He felt a profound compassion well up within him, stronger than any fear. The figure spoke again, its voice trembling. "We suffer, we long for the light, but cannot reach it. Pray, offer, help us." And then the glow faded, the form dissolved, and the chapel fell silent once more. Nicholas remained kneeling, trembling, tears streaming down his face. He understood now, clearer than any dream, clearer than any whisper of intuition, that the souls in purgatory were reaching out to him. His heart had been opened to their suffering, and now they sought his intercession not through dreams, but through direct encounter. From that night onward, the visits intensified. The souls came in various forms, sometimes as faint glimmers, sometimes as shadows, sometimes as voices without bodies, always pleading, always sorrowful. Their presence filled the nights with a weight Nicholas alone could perceive. He grew thinner, paler, his eyes shadowed by sleepless vigils. Yet he prayed with greater fervor, offering his fasting, his tears, his very breath for their release. He did not speak of these encounters except to his confessor, and even then with trembling humility, unsure whether the experiences were consolation or trial. But he accepted them as God's will, believing that if souls were reaching toward him, then God had chosen him, fragile, gentle, unassuming, as their intercessor. As Part 7 draws toward its quiet end, the image of Nicholas kneeling in the dim chapel, surrounded by the invisible presence of suffering souls, takes shape with a solemn tenderness. A door has opened, a door he did not seek but could not close. And one might now wonder, in a hush of reverence mixed with foreboding, how would this fragile priest bear the ever-deepening burden of cries that rose from a place where hope and suffering mingled in the mysterious fire of God's mercy? As the trembling echoes of that first unmistakable encounter slowly settled into the fabric of his days, Part 8 begins by following Nicholas into the deepening night of his vocation. A night not of despair, but of spiritual burden, where the cries of souls in purgatory began to weave themselves into the very rhythm of his breath. What had begun as isolated visions soon became a nightly summons, a mysterious and unrelenting call that pulled him from the security of sleep into a realm of pleading voices and shadowed faces. The gentle priest who once knew only quiet contemplation found himself now standing on a threshold between the living and the dead, a threshold he had not sought yet, could not refuse. And through it all, he remained obedient to the only force he trusted completely, the love of God that had always shaped his heart. The nights grew longer, heavier, thick with the presence of souls who sought his intercession. Nicholas did not know precisely why they came to him, only that their suffering touched him with such intensity that he could not ignore them. Each evening, after the monastery settled into silence, he felt the familiar stirring, a subtle shift in the air, a weight pressing gently at the edge of awareness, like a hand placed softly upon his shoulder. And then the visions would come, not always with clarity, not always with form, but always with a depth of sorrow that pierced him to the core. Sometimes he saw pale faces suspended in a dim light, their eyes filled with longing. Sometimes only voices murmured his name, trembling with regret. Sometimes a shadowy crowd gathered before him, moving with slow, aching gestures, as though trying to reach for something they could not grasp. Nicholas responded the only way his heart knew, with prayer. He fell to his knees, whispering psalms, offering the merits of Christ's passion, begging God to lighten the weight of these souls who had nowhere else to turn. Yet the more he prayed, the more he felt compelled to offer not just words, but something of himself, his strength, his hunger, his very breath. Fasting became for him not a discipline, but a language, a way of speaking on behalf of those who could no longer speak for themselves. He ate little, slept less, and poured out his energy for souls whose pain he could feel even when he did not see them. His body grew thinner, his cheeks hollow, his eyes shadowed by fatigue. Yet a strange radiance surrounded him, a kind of quiet fire that came not from his own strength, but from the grace sustaining him through every sacrifice. The brothers noticed the changes and worried deeply. They saw how Nicholas swayed at the altar during morning mass, how his hands trembled when he lifted the chalice, how he sometimes needed support simply to walk from one place to another. They did not know the cause of his weakness, for Nicholas spoke little of his visions, believing they were a private burden entrusted to him alone. His confessor, however, understood more. To him, Nicholas humbly described the nightly encounters, the pleading voices, the forms that drifted like smoke, yet carried unmistakable sorrow. The confessor listened with reverent caution, discerning not hallucination or delusion, but a mysterious grace, rare, demanding, and profoundly tied to Nicholas's vocation. He gently admonished Nicholas to moderate his fasting, but he also recognized that God was working through this fragile priest in ways he could not fully comprehend. As the months passed, the visions intensified, becoming more vivid and more frequent. Nicholas no longer dreamed peacefully, but entered sleep as though stepping into another world. Sometimes he awoke drenched in tears, haunted by scenes of souls immersed in flames, not the flames of earthly fire, but the spiritual fire of purification. A fire that did not destroy but illuminated every hidden imperfection. He saw the souls reaching upward, longing for the light of God, unable to free themselves without the help of the living. Their anguish was not despair, but yearning, a yearning that resonated within Nicholas like an echo of his own longing for holiness. He understood that purgatory was not a place of punishment, but of mercy, a threshold of hope where souls were made ready for the beatific vision, yet deeply dependent on the prayers of the faithful. This understanding reshaped Nicholas's entire life. He expanded his fasting, offering every hunger pang as a petition for the release of souls. He spent hours in the chapel at night, even as his legs trembled beneath him, whispering the names of those revealed to him in visions. When his brothers found him in the morning, still kneeling, they urged him to rest. But Nicholas smiled gently and said that love could not sleep when souls were in need. He did not say this with pride or dramatization, but with the simple sincerity of someone whose heart could not do otherwise. During the day, the people of Tolentino continued to seek him, with their ordinary worries and sorrows, unaware of the extraordinary battles he fought each night. Nicholas listened to them with the same gentleness as always, but his eyes often carried a faraway look, as though part of his soul remained still among the unseen. He sometimes felt the presence of purgatorial souls even during the day, especially when he prayed for the dying or blessed graves. These moments filled him with a strange mixture of tenderness and responsibility. He never recoiled from them. Instead, he felt honored that God trusted him to intercede. Yet the burden took its toll. His health, always delicate, began to deteriorate. The brothers insisted he take nourishment, and Nicholas obeyed when ordered, though every fiber of his being longed to give more of himself. His confessor reminded him that obedience was itself a form of sacrifice, and Nicholas accepted this truth with humility. Still, he found ways to offer hidden penances, rising earlier, extending his vigils, performing small acts of self-denial. He believed that every sacrifice, no matter how small, became a thread woven into the tapestry of grace that could lift souls from their suffering. One night, during a particularly intense vigil, Nicholas felt the familiar heaviness descend upon the chapel. He knelt in his usual place, hands clasped tightly, whispering prayers through trembling lips. The air thickened, the candlelight dimmed, and a soft moan rippled through the silence. Then, emerging from the shadows like a wave, came a multitude of forms, more souls than ever before, their dim silhouettes filling the chapel. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of longing, their hands outstretched toward him, their sorrow vibrating like a trembling string. The weight of their presence pressed upon Nicholas with such force that he nearly collapsed, but he remained kneeling, tears streaming down his face. "Lord," he whispered, barely able to speak, "have mercy on them. Use my weakness if it helps them. Let my suffering be theirs no longer." In that moment, something within him broke open, a profound surrender that felt both painful and deeply peaceful. He offered himself completely, holding nothing back. The forms began to fade slowly, like mist dissolving into dawn, and Nicholas felt a profound stillness settle around him, as though heaven itself had bowed in quiet acknowledgement. In the days that followed, he felt weaker than ever, yet also filled with a strange peace. The burden had deepened, but so had his trust. He knew now, beyond doubt, that his life would be consumed in this mysterious intercession, that his frailty would become a conduit for grace, that his nights would remain haunted not by darkness, but by souls longing for light. As Part 8 draws gently toward its close, we see Nicholas bearing a weight no one else could perceive, offering his own suffering as a bridge between purgatory and the mercy of God. His silent war continues, hidden, exhausting, yet luminous with compassion. And one may now wonder, with quiet awe and tender dread, how would these sacrifices, these hidden nights of anguish, begin to manifest in the waking world through signs, wonders, and the quiet miracles that slowly unfolded around him, as the long nights of pleading voices and hidden fasting continued to shape the fragile priest. Part 9 begins by carrying Nicholas from the shadows of his private suffering into the quiet, gradual unfolding of grace that touched the world around him through small, almost unnoticeable miracles, miracles that bloomed not from triumph, but from exhaustion, not from strength, but from the trembling charity he offered in silence. In those years, Nicholas became a vessel poured out continually, emptied each night by the cries of souls in purgatory, and filled again each morning by the mercy of God he encountered at the altar. And though his brothers saw only the weariness etched into his thin frame, the people of Tolentino began to witness something different. Small wonders, subtle healings, moments of consolation that seemed to ripple outward from the young priest whose gentleness now carried the weight of heaven. The miracles did not begin with spectacle. They began quietly, the way dawn begins, indiscernible at first, then gradually shaping the world with a softness that makes one wonder when exactly the darkness gave way to light. One of the first signs occurred when a mother came to Nicholas carrying her feverish child, desperate for help. The boy's skin burned with heat, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Nicholas, weak from a night of little sleep, took the child into his arms with infinite care, whispering a prayer so soft it was barely audible. He made the sign of the cross upon the child's forehead, and within moments the fever broke. The mother wept with gratitude, but Nicholas simply smiled and directed her to return home, attributing the healing completely to God. He did not speak of the faint presence he sensed beside him, the lingering impression that one of the souls he had prayed for had, in some mysterious way, interceded on behalf of the child. Soon after, an elderly man known for his harsh temperament and deep loneliness sought Nicholas's counsel. The man had been estranged from his family for years, living with a bitterness that hardened him like stone. When he entered the confessional, Nicholas listened with profound tenderness, gently guiding him through the weight of his sorrow and regret. As the man confessed the sins he had carried for decades, Nicholas felt a strange warmth encircle them, as though the chapel itself were leaning close. When he offered absolution, the man's face softened in a way no one in Tolentino had ever seen. He left the chapel weeping quietly, his hardness dissolved. That same day, he returned to his family, embraced his son for the first time in years, and before night fell, he died peacefully in his sleep, as though the grace of reconciliation had been the final gift he needed before stepping into eternity. Nicholas wept when he learned of the man's passing, sensing again that invisible bridge between the living and the dead, between mercy offered and mercy fulfilled. But among the miracles attributed to Nicholas, the one that became most intimately associated with his name began with a moment of weakness and compassion. His health had deteriorated significantly during this period. His fasting, rigorous prayers, and nightly vigils had worn him down. The prior, concerned for his well-being, commanded him under obedience to eat more. Nicholas obeyed outwardly, but his body, accustomed to minimal nourishment, often rejected even small meals. One day, barely able to stand, he blessed a simple piece of bread before attempting to eat it. As he did so, he felt a sudden peace wash over him, as though God himself touched the bread. He ate it without difficulty, and for the first time in weeks, his strength returned. Subtle, but unmistakable. Word of this event spread among the brothers, and soon people began to ask Nicholas to bless bread for the sick, the anxious, or those seeking comfort. He always blessed it with humility, whispering prayers through pale lips, offering each blessing not as a demonstration of power, but as a gesture of mercy. And again, people reported unexpected recoveries, reconciliations, and small miracles after eating the blessed bread. Mothers who had given up hope for their infants found them suddenly strengthened. Laborers injured in accidents healed faster than expected. Those tormented by sorrow found peace after tasting the bread. The miracles grew not from spectacle, but from the same tenderness that guided Nicholas's every prayer. Over time, the bread of Saint Nicholas became a cherished sacramental, a symbol of the priest whose compassion formed a channel of grace, reaching into countless lives. Yet even as these wonders blossomed outward, Nicholas felt the burden of purgatorial souls grow heavier. Their cries echoed through him at all hours, sometimes even interrupting his thoughts during the day. He would pause mid-task, feeling the sudden ache of a soul pressing close, longing for release, begging for prayer. He never turned away from them. Instead, he offered every miracle, every mass, every small discomfort for them, believing that the grace flowing through his life was never meant for him alone. He saw himself as a bridge between worlds, a fragile bridge, trembling under the weight, yet upheld by divine mercy. Despite this, the people of Tolentino remained mostly unaware of the suffering that accompanied these miracles. They saw only the gentle priest, whose presence comforted them, whose prayers seemed to reach heaven before the words left his mouth, and whose smile, though often weary, radiated a peace that felt like sunlight through a veil. Children approached him without fear, tugging at his sleeve to ask for blessings. The elderly sought him for consolation in their final days. The poor brought him their worries, knowing he would hold their sorrow as tenderly as he held his own. One evening, after a particularly grueling day filled with visitors seeking healing, Nicholas returned to the chapel for prayer. His body ached, and his breath came shallow, but he knelt as always, resting his hands on the cold stone floor. As he prayed, he sensed a familiar presence, the souls of purgatory gathering around him in silent gratitude. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Instead of sorrow, he sensed hope, a faint warmth among the shadows. And then, like a gentle breeze moving through still air, he sensed a voice whisper through his heart. "You have helped us. We carry your prayers with us." Nicholas bowed his head, tears falling freely. For the first time, he felt not only the weight of their suffering, but the light of their gratitude, a shared connection that strengthened him in ways no earthly food or rest could. Still, his body grew weaker. Each miracle cost him strength. Each night drained him further. His brothers remained concerned, yet Nicholas assured them, gently, obediently, that God would sustain him as long as his task required. But they could see the truth. He was giving himself away, piece by fragile piece, for the sake of souls who could not speak except in dreams and whispers. As Part 9 draws to its quiet, reflective close, the image of Nicholas stands tender and luminous. A priest whose frail body became a conduit for miracles born not of power, but of compassion. A man who offered healing through weakness and light through exhaustion. And one may now wonder, with a softness tinged by sorrow, as the miracles increased and his fame spread gently through the countryside, how would Nicholas bear the growing attention when all he longed for was silence? And how would his deepening inner torment shape the years to come? As the gentle ripples of those quiet miracles spread softly across Tolentino, Part 10 begins by carrying Nicholas into a season of life where two currents flowed side by side within him, one of growing renown among the people who sought his help, and one of intensifying interior struggle that left him trembling in the silent hours of the night. The more grace flowed through him, the more the weight of unseen souls pressed upon his fragile spirit. And though the townspeople grew to love him, approaching him with reverence and trust, Nicholas himself felt increasingly drawn toward the hidden corners of humility, wishing above all to remain unseen, to disappear into prayer where God alone could look upon his heart. But such anonymity was no longer possible. His quiet holiness had become a lamp that could not be concealed, and though he did not seek it, its light drew many to him, some with hope, some with desperation, and some simply wanting to be near a man whose presence brought peace. His reputation grew in whispers, never in proclamations. Pilgrims traveled from nearby villages, sometimes from great distances, hoping to receive his blessing or his prayers. Mothers carried sick children to him. Laborers approached him before and after long days in the fields. Elderly men and women came leaning on canes, seeking comfort for their spirits as much as their bodies. Nicholas met each person with the same gentle humility, never allowing his role to overshadow their suffering. He listened with patience, prayed with tenderness, and blessed with the quiet certainty that God alone healed and consoled. And yet each act of compassion took something from him, some hidden portion of his strength, some small measure of his breath, given freely, offered without hesitation. Though Nicholas bore the attention with humility, he did not relish it. Fame, even the quiet, reverent kind, unsettled him. He often slipped away after prayers, retreating into the solitude of his small cell or the shadows of the chapel. He longed for silence, for anonymity, for the invisible path of hidden love he had once walked so easily. But the souls of the living pursued him in daylight, just as the souls of the dead pursued him at night. He felt caught between two worlds, torn by a compassion that stretched him in directions his frail body struggled to endure. His brothers in the monastery saw only part of this. They witnessed his fatigue, the deep shadows beneath his eyes, the way he pressed a trembling hand against the pew during prayer to steady himself. They noticed how often he slipped into silence, withdrawing into interior contemplation even in communal settings. They attributed this to the exhaustion of pastoral demands, and though they loved him dearly, they could not fully grasp the spiritual battle that consumed him. Only his confessor understood the severity of the burden Nicholas carried, for Nicholas continued to speak of the nightly visits with humility and sorrow, describing the souls who came to him like travelers lost in a fog, calling out to him with voices thick with longing. But as Nicholas's fame grew, so too did the intensity of these visions. He began to see not just individual souls but entire crowds, multitudes lingering in a dim, shifting twilight, each soul marked by its own story, its own regrets, its own aching desire for God. Their presence overwhelmed him. Some nights he felt as though he could scarcely breathe beneath the weight of their sorrow. The cries grew louder, more urgent, filling his dreams and spilling into his waking moments. He sometimes paused mid-sentence while speaking to the brothers, his expression suddenly distant, as though hearing something beyond their human ears. When questioned gently, he simply bowed his head and whispered a prayer, declining to explain further. His physical decline grew more evident. He grew thinner still, almost translucent in his frailty. His hands shook even when he held nothing. There were days when he could not rise from bed without assistance, when the mere act of walking from his cell to the chapel exhausted him. And yet he persisted, celebrating Mass, praying for the dead, offering counsel to the troubled, always giving more than his body allowed. The fatigue etched itself deeply into his features, and though he never complained, the brothers felt a growing dread that the candle of his life might burn itself out far too soon. The most terrifying of his visions came during a period of illness that struck him with sudden severity. His fever rose, and he lay trembling on his narrow bed, murmuring prayers through cracked lips. The brothers prayed beside him, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, begging God to ease his suffering. But Nicholas's mind had slipped into the realm that hovered between waking and dream, the threshold where his deepest burdens lived. In that fevered darkness, He saw himself standing at the edge of an immense chasm filled with a shimmering fire. Not a fire that consumed, but a fire that purified, its flames rising like luminous waves. Within the flames he saw countless souls, their faces lifted toward him with pleading eyes. Their cries shook him to the marrow. "Help us," they whispered, their voices trembling like broken reeds. "Pray, offer, do not leave us." He wanted to run to them, to reach them, to embrace them, but a great distance separated them, a distance he could not cross. He cried out in anguish, lifting his hands toward the swirling flames, offering his suffering in a voice raw with desperation. "Lord, take me instead," he whispered, "or take whatever you will, only let them see your light." The vision grew brighter, the flames rising higher, the cries spiraling upward like smoke. Nicholas felt his heart strain within him, as though about to tear under heaven's weight. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision dissolved, leaving him trembling and spent, his breath shallow, his body drenched in cold sweat. When his fever broke days later, Nicholas awoke with eyes hollow, yet shining with new clarity. He understood more deeply now that his intercession was costly, not because God demanded suffering, but because love itself stretched the heart until it resembled Christ's own. He accepted this truth with peaceful resignation, offering each moment of his life, every breath, every weakness, every pulse of pain, for the souls entrusted to him. Yet the physical toll intensified. His brothers begged him to rest, to eat, to allow himself to recover, and he obeyed as best he could. But his heart remained restless until he returned to prayer. Meanwhile, among the people of Tolentino, the quiet stories of his miracles spread further. They spoke of him with reverence, calling him a living saint, though Nicholas recoiled gently from the term. He believed himself a servant, nothing more. And yet the more he sought humility, the more others sought him. He became a paradox, a man who longed for hiddenness, yet could not escape the gentle fame that arose from his compassion. Even children sensed something extraordinary about him. They followed him on the roads, tugging at his sleeves, bringing him small gifts of fruit or flowers, touched not by spectacle, but by the soft glow of holiness that emanated from him. Still, Nicholas felt increasingly torn between this growing renown and the private torment that defined his nights. He worried that attention might draw him away from the souls who needed him, yet he also felt that God worked through him for the living as well as the dead. He tried to balance both calls, offering himself without reserve. But as his body weakened and the visions grew more intense, he sensed that he was approaching a threshold of suffering that would soon test him in ways he had never imagined. As Part 10 draws gently toward its reflective close, the image of Nicholas stands at once luminous and fragile, a humble priest sought by many for healing and consolation, yet haunted by nightly cries that only he could hear. His life had become a delicate weaving of grace and torment, of outward miracles and inward battles, and one may now wonder, with quiet apprehension and tender admiration, as his strength continued to wane beneath the unbearable weight of souls, how would Nicholas face the final stage of his earthly journey, where illness, sacrifice, and divine love would converge in the fragile vessel of his body? As the fragile line between his outward ministry and inward suffering grew ever thinner, Part 11 begins by carrying Nicholas into the final season of his earthly pilgrimage, a season in which his body, once merely delicate, now faltered beneath the strain of years spent pouring himself out for others. The gentle priest of Tolentino, beloved by the townspeople and entrusted with the cries of souls in purgatory, began to feel the slow unraveling of his physical strength, as though each night of prayer, each fast, each whispered offering had carved a deeper hollow within him. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit burned with a clarity and peace that seemed almost luminous. He knew the end of his earthly journey was drawing near, not with fear or resistance, but with the quiet acceptance of a servant who has given all he could give and now prepares to return to the one who called him. The decline began subtly at first, faintness during prayer, trembling hands that struggled to lift the chalice, moments of dizziness that left him gripping the edge of a pew to remain standing. The brothers urged him repeatedly to rest, to take nourishment, to allow his body time to recover. Nicholas obeyed when commanded, but his heart remained restless, longing for the chapel's silence where he believed the souls in purgatory waited for him as faithfully as the sun waits for dawn. Even when confined to bed at times, he prayed continuously, whispering psalms through dry lips, offering each breath as a petition for those who had sought him in dreams and visions. The more his body dimmed, the brighter his compassion seemed to shine. In those days, Nicholas felt a profound nearness to Christ's suffering. He often meditated on the crucifix, tracing with trembling fingers the carved wounds of the Savior, seeing in them a mirror of his own aching limbs and weary heart. But he did not dwell on pain for pain's sake. For him, suffering was a language of love, not a punishment, not a burden imposed, but a way of joining Christ in his redemptive mercy. If my weakness can lighten even one soul's journey toward the light of God, he whispered one evening, then let this weakness be my offering. The brothers who overheard him wept in silence, feeling the holiness of the moment press upon their hearts, like a tender, sorrowful blessing. As his illness deepened, Nicholas found increasing difficulty in walking from his cell to the chapel. The steps that once carried him with quiet ease now felt like steep ascents up a mountain of exhaustion. The prior assigned younger brothers to support him, and they guided him carefully along the corridor, their arms steadying his trembling frame. Yet even with assistance, Nicholas always bowed his head in reverence upon entering the chapel, as though stepping into sacred ground he did not dare approach casually. They often found him staring with longing at the tabernacle, his eyes filled with a depth of love that seemed almost too great for his broken body to contain. The Eucharist became, in these final months, his source of strength and consolation. On days when illness confined him to bed, the brothers brought Holy Communion to him, placing the sacred host gently upon his tongue. Each time, Nicholas received it as though it were his first and last communion, his face softening, his breath slowing, his entire being surrendering to the presence of Christ dwelling within him. He clung to the Eucharist not as a symbol, but as a living encounter, a meeting between a weary soul and the love that sustained him through nights of anguish and days of frailty. Despite his declining strength, the visions of souls in purgatory did not cease. If anything, they grew more frequent, more intense, as though the souls sensed that their intercessor was nearing the end of his race. The nights, once merely restless, now became battlegrounds of spiritual longing. Nicholas lay awake for hours, his body racked with pain, while the unseen voices whispered around him with aching desperation. He no longer saw the souls with clarity, his eyesight blurred by illness, but he felt their presence like a cold wind around his bed. At times he reached out into the darkness, his thin hands trembling, whispering, "I am here. I have not forgotten you." These moments, though exhausting, filled him with a tender peace. He believed that even as he weakened, his prayers gained greater potency, distilled by suffering into something purer and more acceptable before God. His brothers, witnessing these nights, pleaded with him to rest, to surrender the visions, to focus only on his recovery. But Nicholas smiled gently and replied, "The souls call not for themselves alone. But for the love of God, how can I refuse love when it asks for me?" They could not answer him. They could only keep vigil at his bedside, reciting psalms softly, feeling both the weight of impending sorrow and the quiet awe of standing in the presence of a dying saint. There came a day when Nicholas, frailer than ever, requested to celebrate Mass one final time. The brothers hesitated, fearing the exertion would end his life, but he pleaded with such sincerity that they relented. They carried him carefully to the chapel and placed him before the altar. His hands shook so violently that another priest assisted him, supporting the chalice and paten, as Nicholas whispered the sacred words. His voice was barely audible, yet every syllable seemed to flow with an intensity of devotion that filled the chapel with a palpable stillness. When he raised the Eucharist, tears fell from his eyes, dripping onto the altar cloth like dew. "My Lord," he whispered, "receive my life, as you received this offering." It was the last Mass he ever attempted, and those present later said they felt as though heaven itself had drawn near. In the weeks that followed, his illness progressed swiftly. Nicholas could no longer rise from bed. His breathing grew shallow, his skin pale and translucent. Yet his spirit remained luminous. He welcomed his brothers with smiles, spoke blessings over them, and asked continually for news of the people of Tolentino. He prayed for the sick, the poor, the dying, and the souls of purgatory with a fervor that defied the frailty of his frame. As his body unraveled, his charity expanded, embracing everyone who had touched his life, whether in the flesh or in the shadows of vision. One evening, sensing that death approached, Nicholas asked his confessor to remain with him through the night. He expressed gratitude for the kindness of his brothers, for the love of the townspeople, and for the mysterious grace that had allowed him to serve the souls in purgatory. "I have done little," he said softly, "but God has been everything." His confessor, overcome, could only press his hand gently and whisper prayers of peace. As the night deepened, Nicholas's breathing grew slower, more labored. He gazed toward the crucifix on the wall, his eyes filled with both longing and calm. The brothers gathered around him, reciting the prayers for the dying. Nicholas whispered faint words of intercession, offering once more his suffering for the souls who had sought him so desperately throughout his life. And then, in a breath as soft as a sigh, he surrendered his spirit into the hands of God. As Part 11 comes to its tender, sorrowful close, the gentle priest lies now in the quiet stillness of death, his body broken, his mission seemingly complete, yet his soul radiant with the peace of one who has given everything in love. And one might now wonder, in the hush that follows his final breath, what happened in the very moment his weary spirit crossed from this world into the next? And how did heaven receive the one who had spent his life hearing the cries of those who longed for its light? As the hush of his final breath lingers like a soft echo through the stone hallways of the monastery, Part 12 begins by carrying Nicholas from the fragile boundary of earthly suffering into the moment of release. A passage so gentle, so deeply rooted in peace, that those who witnessed it spoke for years afterward of a quiet holiness that seemed to settle over the room like a warm veil. His brothers, gathered at his bedside, felt the air itself change as his soul slipped from the frail vessel that had borne so much pain, as though the heavy atmosphere of illness dissolved into an unexplainable lightness. The small cell that had seen him tremble with fever, whisper prayers through cracked lips, and offer every ounce of strength for the souls entrusted to him, was now transformed into a sacred threshold, a place where heaven bent close to earth and received a weary servant with tenderness beyond human understanding. Nicholas's death was not marked by dramatic signs or visible miracles, but by a profound stillness that descended upon the monastery almost instantly. The brothers who had wept at the thought of losing him now found themselves enveloped in a sense of serenity so unexpected, so complete, that it brought more awe than sorrow. They knelt in silence around his bed, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across his peaceful face. His hands, once trembling from weakness, rested quietly on the blanket. His eyes, closed gently, held no trace of suffering. And though his body appeared fragile, worn thin from years of fasting and intercession, his expression radiated the calm dignity of a soul that had completed its journey and found its rest in God. The room felt filled with presence, not the kind that could be seen or touched, but the kind that brushed the heart with the sense that holy ground had been entered. The confessor who had accompanied Nicholas through his hardest trials remained kneeling beside him, tears slipping down his cheeks, his hand still gently holding the hand that had grown cold. He later said that at the moment of Nicholas's passing, he felt a shift in the silence, as though countless souls, once burdened and sorrowful, rejoiced invisibly around their intercessor. He could not see them, but he sensed them, like a soft chorus of gratitude rising in the depths of his spirit. Word of Nicholas's death spread quickly through Tolentino. The people, who had loved him dearly during his life, now gathered at the doors of the monastery in stunned quiet. They had known he was ill, but many had prayed fiercely for his recovery, believing that God would spare the town's gentle healer. When they heard the news, their grief was not loud or chaotic, but tender and reverent. Women wept softly. Men lowered their heads in silence. Children clung to their mothers' hands, sensing the sorrow though they did not fully understand it. For many, Nicholas had been more than a priest. He had been a steady presence, a gentle anchor in their lives, a quiet reminder that God's mercy walked among them in human form. The brothers prepared his body with loving care, washing him gently, dressing him in fresh white garments, and placing him in the chapel where he had spent so many nights in prayer. As they tended to him, they could not help but notice how peaceful he appeared. More peaceful, they said, than at any moment during his final months. His face bore no trace of pain, only a serenity that seemed to reflect the promise of eternal rest. They arranged candles around him, and throughout the day, people entered the chapel in steady streams to kneel beside him, lay flowers at his feet, and whisper prayers of gratitude. Some said that the air in the chapel felt unusually warm that day, filled with a fragrance not of incense or flowers, but of something indescribable, something like sweetness, like purity, as though heaven itself had kissed the place. Others said that as they prayed beside his body, they felt a lifting in their hearts, a sense of comfort that soothed their grief. A few spoke of moments when the candles seemed to glow brighter, flickering gently as though responding to an unseen breath. These were not official miracles, nor were they recorded formally, but they became part of the whispered stories passed among the faithful, stories of a holy death filled with grace. During those first hours after his passing, something remarkable occurred in the hearts of the brothers. Their sorrow began to take on a new shape, not the heavy sorrow of loss, but the tender sorrow of gratitude. They remembered the frail priest who had walked among them quietly, who had prayed long after they had gone to sleep, who had cared for the poor with unwavering gentleness, and who had borne the weight of unseen souls with a courage that defied his fragile body. They remembered him not as a man defeated by illness, but as one who had given everything he had, every breath, every night, every tear, for the sake of others. As the sun began to set on the day of his death, the monks gathered in the chapel to chant the office of the dead. Their voices rose slowly, reverently, filling the space with a somber harmony. Outside, the people of Tolentino lit candles in their homes and whispered prayers for the priest who had blessed their children, comforted their sick, and walked their streets with humility. It was said that the entire town seemed wrapped in a hush that night, as though united in a single heartbeat of mourning and thanksgiving. But in the midst of this communal sorrow, something deeper and more mysterious unfolded, not through visions or apparitions, but through a profound sense of presence that touched many hearts. Several of the brothers later confided that as they prayed beside Nicholas's body, they felt as though he were praying with them, not in words, but in a silent intercession carried out from beyond the veil. A few townspeople spoke of dreaming of him that night, dreams in which he appeared radiant, smiling gently, his hands raised in blessing. These dreams comforted them deeply, as if Nicholas's spirit, newly released from its suffering, had turned immediately to console those he loved. In the quiet days that followed, as preparations were made for his burial, the brothers reflected on the final lessons Nicholas had taught them. His life had shown them that holiness wasn't found in grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but in the steady, hidden giving of oneself, in the quiet acceptance of suffering, in the gentle listening to the cries of others, in the unwavering trust that God's mercy fills even the darkest places. His death had revealed a peace that could only come from a life poured out completely in love. When the time came to place his body in the earth, the people gathered once more, filling the small churchyard with a solemn reverence. The monks lowered him gently into the ground, their voices trembling as they chanted the final prayers. A soft breeze stirred through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint scent of wild herbs from the surrounding hills. It felt like a benediction, a quiet blessing upon the resting place of one who had lived not for himself, but for others, both living and dead. As Part 12 draws to its reflective close, the image of Nicholas of Tolentino rests in the stillness of death, his body returned to the earth, his soul carried gently into the embrace of the God he served with every breath. The town mourns, the brothers pray, and a sacred silence settles over the place where his earthly journey ended. And one might now wonder, with a sense of awe and tender anticipation, what happened in the days following his burial, when testimony after testimony began to arise, stories of healings, visions, and answered prayers that spoke of a saint whose work did not end with death, but continued with greater power from heaven. As the earth settled over his fragile body and the prayers of the community slowly faded into quiet memory, Part 13 begins by carrying Nicholas beyond the threshold of death into the vast and mysterious realm of his continuing work. For though his life had ended, his compassion had not. In the days and weeks after his burial, an extraordinary hush seemed to cover Tolentino, a hush not of grief alone, but of expectant wonder, as though the air itself held its breath. People moved softly through the streets, speaking of him in whispers, lingering near the monastery, as though hoping to glimpse some lingering trace of his spirit. The brothers, still tender with sorrow, felt the absence of his gentle presence in the rhythm of their days. The empty spot where he once knelt in the chapel, the silent cell that no longer flickered with candlelight during the night hours, the missing voice that once rose softly in the choir stalls. And yet, even in this emptiness, something began to stir, something that hinted that Nicholas had not withdrawn from them entirely. It began, as many holy stories do, with a single moment so small it might have passed unnoticed if not for the hearts it touched. Only a few days after his burial, a woman from the town arrived at the monastery holding her infant son, who had been gravely ill for weeks. She had hoped that Nicholas would bless the child before dying, but his illness had progressed too quickly, and she had been unable to reach him in time. Now, in desperation and sorrow, she came to pray at his tomb. The brothers watched quietly as she knelt before the freshly laid earth, weeping softly, her child weak in her arms. After some time, she placed the child on the ground beside the tomb and whispered a prayer of trust so fragile it seemed carried on trembling breath rather than spoken aloud. As she prayed, the infant stirred, opened his eyes, and let out a strong, steady cry, the first healthy sound he had made in days. The woman gasped, clutching her child to her chest. She rushed to tell the brothers, who examined the child and found him remarkably improved. They gave thanks to God, uncertain of what had occurred but sensing that grace had touched them. Word spread quickly. The villagers, already devoted to Nicholas in life, now felt drawn to him in a new way after death. They began visiting his tomb with petitions, some asking for healing, others for reconciliation in their families, others for courage in times of sorrow. Some came simply to sit beside the grave in silence, trusting that the priest who had carried their burdens in life might still hear them from beyond. And soon, more stories arose. A man whose leg injury had left him unable to walk without pain found himself suddenly free of suffering after praying at the tomb. A widow tormented by fear and loneliness dreamed of Nicholas standing beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she awoke with a peace she had not felt in years. A young girl who had been plagued by night terrors claimed she saw a glowing figure enter her room and bless her. From that night forward, she slept without fear. The brothers listened to these testimonies with cautious reverence. They did not rush to declare miracles, for the church demanded careful discernment. But in their hearts, they recognized the familiar tenderness of God working quietly, just as he had worked through Nicholas in life. And though they were careful not to encourage sensationalism, they could not deny the pattern that emerged. Nicholas's compassion had crossed the boundary of death. Just as he had interceded fervently for souls in purgatory, now he seemed to intercede for the living with renewed strength, freed from the limitations of his frail body. The most profound testimony, however, came from those suffering in spirit rather than in body. People began reporting visions and dreams, not of healing alone, but of Nicholas appearing in moments of deep inner turmoil. A farmer who had lost his crops and feared for his family's survival dreamed of Nicholas kneeling beside him in a barren field, whispering words of courage. When he awoke, he found a sense of determination renewed within him. A young widow who had struggled for months with despair reported seeing Nicholas standing near her prayer corner, lifting his hand in blessing. She described the vision with trembling reverence, convinced that it had saved her from sinking deeper into sorrow. Stories like these multiplied, weaving themselves into the spiritual fabric of Tolentino as naturally as threads in a tapestry. The people began to feel that Nicholas had become a spiritual protector, not only for souls in purgatory, but for all who carried the wounds of earthly life. He had become a bridge between realms, offering comfort from the place of light to those still walking through the shadows. The brothers themselves experienced quiet signs of his continued presence. One evening, as they gathered in the chapel for Compline, a soft fragrance filled the air. Not the usual scent of beeswax or incense, but something sweeter, almost floral, though no flowers were present. The scent drifted gently through the choir stalls and lingered around the altar, then faded as slowly as it had appeared. The brothers exchanged glances, knowing that such fragrances had often been associated with the passing of saints. Another night, a young monk struggling with doubt and interior dryness knelt before Nicholas's tomb, whispering a prayer for guidance. As he knelt, he felt a warmth settle over his shoulders, a sensation so distinct and gentle that he wept with relief. He later described it as though a hand had rested lightly upon him, steadying his trembling spirit. These quiet wonders, though not dramatic, carried deep significance for the community. They revealed not only Nicholas's sanctity, but the continuation of his mission. The souls of Purgatory, whose anguished cries had filled his nights, now seemed to accompany him in a different way. The brothers sensed that Nicholas had not abandoned them for heavenly rest, but had entered into a new dimension of service, interceding with greater clarity, greater strength, and greater freedom than he ever had on earth. As the months passed, devotion to Nicholas grew beyond Tolentino. Travelers and merchants brought stories to neighboring towns, and soon people from distant regions began arriving to visit his tomb. They came with illnesses, with grief, with burdens they could not speak aloud. Some left healed, others left strengthened. All left certain that they had encountered something holy. The monastery, once a quiet home for a handful of friars, now found itself at the heart of a growing pilgrimage. The brothers welcomed each visitor with the same humility Nicholas had shown, knowing that their beloved brother in Christ was continuing his work from heaven. Yet amid these signs, the people felt something even deeper, a sense of Nicholas's closeness. They spoke of him not as a distant saint, but as a gentle friend walking beside them in their struggles. Even children felt this nearness. They said they dreamed of him smiling softly, his hands folded, his thin face glowing with a kindness that made fear vanish. And though these dreams were simple, they bore the unmistakable imprint of grace. The church began receiving reports of these events. Bishops listened, investigators were sent, and the stories were gathered with care. The testimonies were consistent, reverent, free of exaggeration. They spoke of healing, comfort, reconciliation, and above all, Nicholas's unmistakable tenderness, a tenderness that had touched them in life and now touched them even more profoundly through death. As Part 13 comes to its quiet, contemplative close, the image of Nicholas's tomb stands not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new chapter, one where miracles blossom quietly like flowers in the early dawn, where the living and dead meet in a shared communion of compassion, and where a humble priest's legacy begins to shape the faith of generations. And one may now wonder, with soft anticipation, how would the Church respond to this growing devotion? And how would Nicholas's quiet holiness, once hidden in the shadows of a small Italian town, rise into the broader light of recognition and veneration? As the testimonies of healings, dreams, and consolations multiplied like soft ripples across Italy, Part 14 begins by carrying Nicholas's legacy from the intimate circle of Tolentino into the wider embrace of the Church, where the gentle priest who once lived in quiet obscurity now stood poised to become a beacon of hope for countless souls. In the years following his death, the devotion surrounding him did not fade, as so many local pieties often do. Instead, it swelled steadily, strengthened by the persistent accounts of miracles that bore the unmistakable hallmark of divine grace. Pilgrims arrived in ever greater numbers, approaching his tomb with reverence, whispering prayers through trembling lips, and leaving with hearts unburdened, bodies healed, or grief softened by a peace that exceeded explanation. The brothers, though humble and cautious, could not ignore the growing signs. Something extraordinary was unfolding, something that demanded the attention of the wider Church. The first formal inquiry began when a nearby bishop, moved by the volume of testimonies, initiated an investigation into Nicholas's life and the events that had followed his death. He sent clerics to Tolentino to collect stories with careful precision, ensuring that each report was examined with both reverence and skepticism. The monks cooperated fully, providing records of Nicholas's life, his writings, and their own personal recollections. They described his frailty, his unfaltering devotion, his hidden nights of prayer, and the mysterious sufferings he bore for souls in purgatory. They spoke of his humility, his simplicity, and the quiet way he had carried burdens far heavier than his fragile body seemed capable of enduring. The bishop listened with growing awe, recognizing that Nicholas had lived not as a figure of outward grandeur, but as an instrument of divine love carved from weakness. As the investigation proceeded, more witnesses stepped forward. Farmers, widows, laborers, merchants, mothers, children, all spoke with a sincerity that touched the hearts of the investigators. They shared stories of miraculous recoveries from fever, recovery from injuries, sudden peace in moments of despair, reconciliation in families long torn by conflict, and the strange, sweet fragrance that sometimes filled the chapel during prayer. They spoke of dreams in which Nicholas appeared, not in blazing glory but with the same gentle humility he had shown in life, offering small gestures of comfort, an outstretched hand, a whispered blessing, a reassuring smile. These encounters, though simple, bore an unmistakable unity, each shaped by the tenderness that had defined Nicholas's earthly ministry. What struck the church officials most deeply was the consistency of these accounts. They came from people of all ages and walks of life, yet the descriptions aligned with remarkable harmony. Nicholas did not appear as a stern figure or a triumphant victor. He appeared as a servant, gentle, compassionate, attentive to the suffering of others. This fidelity between his earthly character and his heavenly intercession spoke more convincingly than any single miracle. It revealed a continuity of grace that could not be ignored. The investigation continued for years, moving slowly, methodically, ensuring that nothing was accepted without careful discernment. The Church, in her wisdom, knew that declarations of sainthood carried immense significance, shaping the faith of future generations. She sought truth not in haste, but in patient, prayerful evaluation. Yet, as the inquiry deepened, the evidence grew increasingly luminous. One account, recorded by a cleric, described a man who had been bedridden with a grievous illness that doctors could not remedy. After receiving a small piece of bread blessed at Nicholas's tomb, he experienced a dramatic improvement, rising from his bed within hours, his strength restored. Another testimony described a child who had nearly drowned but recovered fully after the family prayed fervently at Nicholas's gravesite. These testimonies, reinforced by the spiritual transformations witnessed in countless souls, gradually formed a mosaic of divine intervention. The devotion to Nicholas continued to spread. Churches in nearby regions began dedicating altars to him. Artists painted his likeness with tenderness. Thin, serene, dressed in the black habit of the Augustinians, often holding a lily or a loaf of bread, symbols of purity and charity. His image traveled far beyond Tolentino, carried by pilgrims who spoke of him not only as a healer of bodies, but as a guardian of souls, especially those in purgatory. His special connection to the suffering souls became a central part of his emerging identity. People began invoking him as a powerful intercessor for the departed, asking for his help in easing the pains of loved ones who had passed. Stories circulated of families who felt sudden peace after entrusting their deceased relatives to God through Nicholas's intercession. Some reported dreams of departed loved ones appearing grateful, serene, as though the prayers had lifted them into the warmth of divine mercy. The Augustinian order, initially cautious, gradually embraced Nicholas as a model of their charism. His life embodied the heart of Augustine's teachings, humility, love for God, compassion for souls, and the pursuit of holiness through the quiet surrender of the will. Friars across Italy and beyond spoke of him in sermons, drawing inspiration from his hidden sacrifices and his unwavering devotion to the Eucharist. His story became a reminder to young novices that holiness was not achieved through extraordinary feats, but through the steady offering of oneself in ordinary moments. As devotion grew, the Church eventually determined that the time had come to recognize formally the sanctity that countless people already believed in their hearts. The canonization process, though lengthy, unfolded with a clarity that seemed ordained. When the moment arrived for the Church to declare Nicholas of Tolentino a saint, the proclamation carried not the triumphant thunder of a distant mandate, but the gentle warmth of a truth long known by the faithful. He was canonized in 1325, just a few decades after his death, a rare and swift recognition in an age when centuries often passed before such declarations were made. His feast day was set, his name inscribed among the saints, and his mission as a protector of souls formally affirmed by the Church. Following his canonization, devotion to Saint Nicholas of Tolentino blossomed across Europe. Churches were dedicated in his honor, paintings and sculptures depicting his compassion-filled sacred spaces, and his intercession became a cornerstone of Catholic devotion to the holy souls in Purgatory. Communities prayed novenas to him, especially during the month of November when the Church remembers the dead. Parents taught their children his story. The humble friar who listened to the cries of the forgotten, who fasted for the weary, who prayed through the long hours of the night when others slept, who offered his own suffering so that others might find light. His name became synonymous with hope for the departed and comfort for the living. Yet beyond these visible honors, something deeper took root. Nicholas's life left a mark not merely on the institutions of the Church, but on the hearts of ordinary believers. He became a gentle reminder that holiness does not require greatness in the eyes of the world. It requires only love, love offered quietly, faithfully, generously. His story taught that the suffering of others, whether seen or unseen, calls for compassion. His example reassured those who felt weak or inadequate, showing that God often works most powerfully through fragile vessels, and his intercession opened a path of mercy for souls longing for the light of God's presence. As Part 14 comes to its contemplative close, the gentle priest of Tolentino stands now recognized by the Church as a saint, a bridge between earth and heaven, a guardian of souls, a model of compassionate sacrifice. His legacy has spread far beyond the modest walls of the monastery, where he once prayed through sleepless nights. And one may now wonder, with soft anticipation, what lasting spiritual lessons would Nicholas offer to those who seek holiness in their own fragile lives? And how would his quiet story continue to shape hearts long after his earthly tasks were completed? As the echo of his canonization resounded gently through the centuries and the glow of his holiness settled into the rhythm of Christian devotion, Part 15 begins by inviting us to walk slowly alongside the enduring legacy of Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, a legacy not forged in thunderous miracles or grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent offering of a frail heart that loved without measure. His story, once confined to the narrow streets of a humble Italian town, now ripples across time like a soft hymn sung through generations. Churches bear his name, statues depict his thin and gentle form, prayers for the holy souls rise through his intercession, and countless believers, especially those who grieve, who hope, who wait for the mercy of God, find in him a companion who understands the fragile spaces of the human spirit. And yet, beyond these visible signs of devotion lies something more intimate, more deeply woven into the fabric of Christian thought. The spiritual lesson of a man whose life reveals that love, when freely offered, becomes a fire that illuminates even the darkest corners of suffering. Through the centuries, the faithful have whispered his name in hospitals, at gravesides, in chapels empty except for a solitary candle flickering before the tabernacle. They have called upon him in moments of quiet fear, trusting that the saint who once heard the cries of souls unseen will now hear their own trembling petitions. Mothers pray to him for children lost too soon. Widowers invoke him when loneliness settles heavily on the heart. Families kneel together, asking him to carry the memory of their departed loved ones into the radiant presence of God. And each prayer, however small, becomes part of the great tapestry of devotion that Nicholas inspires, an ever-growing reminder that love does not end with death, and that the communion of saints is more than an idea, but a living bond that unites heaven and earth. In many parts of the world, his feast day remains a cherished moment of remembrance. Candles are lit, masses offered for the departed, and the bread of Saint Nicholas, a tradition born from his gentle miracle, is blessed and shared with reverence. This blessed bread, given to the sick and the sorrowing, serves as a quiet sign that healing often begins with tenderness, that grace enters the world through acts that seem small but are filled with intention. When believers partake of the bread, they remember not only Nicholas's miraculous gift, but also the countless nights he spent offering his own hunger for the relief of others. They remember the delicate priest who could barely stand yet knelt for hours in prayer, who whispered the names of souls he had never met, whose heart beat in rhythm with the suffering of the forgotten. Artists throughout history have been captivated by his story, painting him with flames or souls rising behind him, or with a lily held gently in his hand as a symbol of purity. Others depict him gazing compassionately upon the suffering, his eyes soft with the sorrow and hope he carried so faithfully. Sculptures show him thin, almost weightless, as though shaped more by the spirit than by the flesh. His posture bent slightly forward, as if always listening for the faint cries of those who call from beyond. And in every depiction, there is an unmistakable gentleness, a quiet sorrow wrapped in serenity, a reminder that even the most fragile among us can blaze with the light of mercy. Theologians, too, have reflected deeply on his life, drawing from it an understanding of purgatory not as a place of fear, but as a place of hope, a place where the love of God purifies every wound, every regret, every unfinished longing. Nicholas showed that the suffering of souls is not a punishment, but a yearning turned toward light, a longing that can be soothed by the prayers of the living. His intercession for the dead softened the Church's imagination, teaching believers to see purgatory not through the lens of dread, but through the lens of compassion. In him, the Church found a gentle guide who revealed that the boundary separating this life from the next is not a wall, but a veil, thin enough for love to pass through. In the wider world, his legacy continues to inspire acts of charity. Many communities founded hospitals, orphanages, and shelters in his honor, seeing in his life a call to care for the weak and forgotten. These institutions carry forward his spirit by tending to those whose suffering is often overlooked, offering comfort not only through medicine or shelter, but through presence, through the same quiet companionship that Nicholas offered so generously. His life reminds the faithful that holiness is found not in perfection, but in compassion, not in supernatural visions alone, but in the daily commitment to see Christ in the least of his brothers and sisters. But among all the ways his legacy endures, perhaps the most profound is the personal transformation that his story invites. Those who encounter his life often find themselves asking gentle, probing questions. What suffering in my life can I offer for others? Whom have I forgotten, whose pain echoes faintly but persistently, awaiting my compassion? How can my own frailty, physical, emotional, or spiritual, become a place where God's mercy flows for the sake of someone else? These questions do not arise from guilt or obligation. They arise from the example of a man who lived his entire life as a prayer. Nicholas teaches that holiness is not a distant peak reserved for the strong, but a path accessible to anyone willing to love with humility. He teaches that suffering, when united with Christ, becomes a mysterious gift that ripples outward in ways we may never fully understand. And he teaches that the dead are not gone. They remain in the embrace of God, connected to us through the invisible thread of grace that binds the entire church together. For the elderly believer who lights a candle in the quiet evening hours, Nicholas becomes a companion in prayer. For the grieving parent who yearns for signs of hope, Nicholas becomes a gentle reminder that love reaches beyond death. For the tired priest who feels overwhelmed by pastoral burdens, Nicholas becomes a model of humble endurance. And for all who feel small or insignificant, he becomes a witness that greatness is found in offering what little we have with sincerity. Through the centuries, stories of Nicholas continue to unfold. Pilgrims still journey to Tolentino, kneeling beside his relics, whispering prayers that echo the same longing heard by the gentle friar in his lifetime. Some leave with miracles, others leave with subtle graces, clarity, peace, forgiveness, courage. Many leave with the sense that Nicholas has walked beside them, just as he once walked beside souls in the twilight of Purgatory. His presence lingers like a soft fragrance, the scent of a life poured out in love. As this final part gently draws to its close, the story of Saint Nicholas of Tolentino settles into the heart like a quiet blessing. His life, marked by weakness and illuminated by compassion, invites us to listen more deeply to the suffering around us, to the silent cries of those who have no voice, to the movements of grace calling us to love with greater tenderness. It reminds us that holiness often hides in humility, that sacrifice offered quietly becomes a light that shines far beyond our lifetime, and that the communion between the living and the dead is woven not with fear, but with love. And so we end where Nicholas's life always pointed, with the lingering question that opens a doorway into our own hearts. What quiet offering within us might God use to bring light to someone wandering in shadows?